can I invite Jan Brooke from the World Association for Waterborne Transport Infrastructure to say a few words about work they're doing on port standards.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jan Brooke. I wear a lot of different hats when it comes to climate change, in particular climate change adaptation. But I'm here today on behalf of PIANC, the World Association for Waterborne Transport Infrastructure. PIANC, for those of you who are not familiar with the organisation, is focused on the preparation of technical good practice. So we have commissions dealing with maritime, inland, recreational navigation and also environment. And so my role with this particular working group, 178 on adaptation, is as the mentor of that group on behalf of PIANC's Environment Commission. I also act as focal point for Navigating a Changing Climate, which is an initiative under the Marrakesh Partnership Global Climate Action. So the Navigating a Changing Climate, just to introduce that very briefly because it's relevant to why we're doing this particular piece of work, is an initiative that brings together 10 international associations, all of whom have an interest in port and navigation infrastructure. So you see PIANC at the top of the list on the left there, but we're also working with the Ports and Harbours Association, with the Harbour Masters, with the Maritime Pilots, so all of the users of the navigation infrastructure. And this initiative has 4 main objectives. It aims to improve awareness of climate change and climate change challenge and what can be done to mitigate and to adapt, to share knowledge and good practice, to develop technical good practice guidance, which is the role of Working Group 178 in this case, but also to provide an overall centre of excellence, a coordinated resource for the sector internationally, so that the sector can access news, updates, publications, events and so on that are relevant, that bring together navigation infrastructure on the one hand and climate change issues on the other. The Navigating a Changing Climate Action Plan, which is a kind of core, if you like, of the work of the initiative, has 4 components. It has a component that looks at raising awareness, a component that looks at mitigating climate change, so reducing emissions, a component that looks at adaptation and strengthening resilience, and a component that looks at integrated solutions, so that might be intermodality or it might be nature-based solutions. And obviously the adaptation side of things, nature-based solutions and integrated solutions are also relevant. So we're dealing with a community in the port and navigation sector that might expect to see climate change impacts resulting from flooding, or resulting in rather flooding, changes in storm frequency or the magnitude of storms, changes in local conditions in wind and waves, changes in sediment transport, or also been mentioned, and perhaps one of the most immediate effects that we're seeing in terms of climate-related weather events, but also changes in fog and visibility. That's critical for ports and navigation, changes in ice, changes in river flow, high or low flow, depending on whether you have excess precipitation or drought, and also indirect consequences of changes in air and water temperature. So, for example, the navigation sector has to deal with increased vegetation. If you get warmer waters, you can get blooms of vegetation which can then foul propellers and so on in inland waters. So there's a wide range of different impacts. What we're doing through the preparation of this particular guidance document is trying to help the sector understand when and why and how they need to act. And I'm sure discussions yesterday, I wasn't here unfortunately, but must have touched upon the issue of the business case for adaptation. And many ports in the UK, for example, are private sector ports. They will only act to adapt if they see a business case. So one of the things that we're looking at in terms of why ports should adapt, what are the drivers? Well, on the one hand, you have issues with navigational safety and infrastructure integrity, but on the other, you have issues of downtime and protecting business continuity. So for a commercial port operation, you have the issue of time costing money, and if you have a port out of action for a day or a week or 2 weeks, it costs in terms of the income streams. But also there's an issue with aid, and if the port infrastructure isn't working, and indeed the road and rail isn't working, then you reduce the opportunity to get aid to people who need it in the event of extreme events. So ports on the one hand might be private or public sector commercial operations, but on the other they're also providing a a nationally important infrastructure resource. And so what this guidance tries to do in that context is to help particularly those with existing port and navigation infrastructure, although the guidance is also relevant to new infrastructure, understand the context within which they're working, prepare inventory of assets, look at the stakeholders that should be engaged. It signposts to where information can be picked up on climate change and the related impacts. It helps the user understand what the risks are, what the vulnerabilities are, and it provides a toolbox of measures and recommendation on how to assess and evaluate those measures. So it's not a standard as such, but it is a technical guidance document, and hopefully my intention is that it will be up and running available by the end of this year. So what I've done, rather than going into the detail of the guidance, is just to have a look at some of the things that we've learned as a result of producing that guidance and some of the issues and the challenges that we have to face. And I think two of the key challenges that we've seen are that those that are involved in designing and operating ports and navigation infrastructure still use a lot of conventional methods. They use conventional methods for predicting the nature and magnitude of extreme events, and also in terms of economic evaluation of assets, looking at is standard cost-benefit analysis still applicable in a scenario where you have a changing climate. And what we've found in these two areas, and it's very relevant, I think, to then the financing side of things, is that we need to find different ways of understanding what might happen, what to expect. And the non-stationarity that climate change introduces into the system means an event that we might call, say, a 1 in 500 year event. And 1 in 500 year refers not to the timing of that event, but to the chance of that event, so 0.2% chance in any 1 year. How is the climate changing? Do we change that a 1% chance, or a 2, or a 5, or a 10% chance? And it doesn't mean that if you get an event 1 year that you can't get one for another 500 years. It could happen again next year, and indeed we're starting to see that with certain weather events. So we need to find a way to incorporate that non-stationarity into design. We need to find a way that we're not relying solely on the past to predict the future. And at the moment, we're struggling to identify and recommend specific techniques to use. What we're saying is that designers should look not only at past and recent trends, but at the future. And they should consider the what-if scenario. What if the unthinkable happens? And what the lessons that means for design is we need to design to facilitate modification. So instead of building something this high, thinking that might last forever and protect us against everything, maybe what we need to do is think about building something this high, but how can we modify that? Building it in a way that we can add to it in the future years as the climate changes, so we adapt in an appropriate way. And we also need to understand better perhaps the consequences of failure and how we can improve resilience and build redundancy into the system. We've moved away from building redundancy into infrastructure over recent years because we think we understand what's happening. We maybe need to look again at introducing redundancy, understanding what will happen if a structure fails, improving the resilience in the hinterland so that we can manage those events and bounce back more quickly. And we've also identified issues with conventional evaluation techniques, in particular with benefit cost assessment, because of the role of the discount rate. And because with climate change, we don't really know when the benefits will be delivered, whether they'll be delivered next year or in 10 years or 50 years' time. So looking at multi-criteria analysis, looking at ecosystem approach and so on might be useful ways forward. So what this guidance does is it promotes the use of adaptive management, flexibility in infrastructure design, looking at revised methodologies, revised planning processes, relying on monitoring to be able to help us understand when to adapt or when to modify the structure. But what that also means perhaps is that we need to think again about how we look at the development of the business case, or how we look at investment financing criteria, because that's the conventional ways of assessing projects are not necessarily understanding this flexibility that we need to build into the design in future. Monitoring, early warning systems, contingency planning, I think, will become much more critical as we have to deal with more extreme events. knowing how to respond if something goes wrong, how to bounce back. And we're monitoring there not only the climate parameters, but also asset conditions, and looking at that to inform maintenance. And maintenance is another area where I think we see a real focus on climate change, or will see a focus as a result of climate change. And then exploring, sharing good practice, feeding back that good practice into the guidelines and standards, and engaging stakeholders. And I think my final comment on there, we've already mentioned today, is the use of nature-based solutions. Nature is surprisingly resilient, and maybe we need to make more use of nature when we're looking at engineering design. So that's a very quick canter through our guidance. Hopefully it gives you some idea of the type of issues that we'll be addressing. And I think probably a lot of that is relevant not only to ports and harbours, but also to other types of infrastructure. So hopefully it's of use to you, those of you that are dealing with other types of infrastructure as well.
Okay, and the guidance will be on the website, hopefully by the end of the year. So put the date in your diary.